Er komen 3
So, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome. My name is Saskia van Stein. I'm the director, proud director of the International Architecture Biennale of Rotterdam. A lot of familiar faces, but also some new faces. So, just to contextualize, the Biennale is 2 decades old, and we try to marry design research with the cultural discourse of what the architectural practice can entail. It is to the day, to the hour, that exactly 2 years ago we launched It's About Time. It was the opening 2 years ago. It's incredible. I feel that I've lived 10 years in 2 years. And I'm not going to make an endless amount of remarks around time, although that was very tempting. I will, however, share some thoughts behind the exhibition, because to get started, I will say that this is not a catalogue. We are here for a book launch that is an in-depth research into the notion of time, temporality, maybe even non-linear thinking in the book, which will be contextualized by the authors, the 4 curators. And we have an esteemed set of guests, Janna Bystrykh, Tom Avermaete and Daniel Barber, who will think through, who have read the book already. And we will share some reflections on the first iterations, and then we will open up to the public. And we're also very, very honored and happy to have Tobias and, Catherine here for, they worked extremely hard on the publication, but they're also responsible for the visual identity. And this is that visual identity. Very fresh, one could tell. I will not say anything about it, otherwise I'm just maybe not working through your talk. But I would say hazard signs. That's maybe one word I want to put out there. Hazard signs for the near time. And that's also what we try to do at the IABR. Both my predecessor and I are working towards this question of what are the spatial ramifications of the contemporary climate that we are facing. Because this is, of course, at the core of our consciousness, at the core of our discipline, not yet, but we are here to debate what it would take for those questions to center stage in the core of the architectural discourse and its practice. So it's about time. Oh, I now see, I apologize, that part of the names have fell off, but from the left, Derk Loorbach, who was already appointed when I entered. He's, of course, an esteemed transition thinker, a scientist. And him and I met for the first time, and I thought, this is a brilliant man. But maybe, just maybe, his understanding of contemporary architecture design and what it entails is slightly, let's say, limited. Your word. So then I thought, okay, let's marry theory and a very active theory, because his work is really rooted in deep thinking, words like backcasting, and trying to understand the rootedness, one could say, of our system thinking. We even considered calling the exhibition something with radix, right? So, can you remember? But I thought the practice, we need to bridge that. Is it still a gap? We'll talk about that maybe, theory and practice. But I wanted somebody to help us think from the ground up. And of course, when we think from the ground up, by now we have to acknowledge that our horizon is maybe a vertical domain, something that is brought further in Nature of Hope. But this is why and where Peter Veenstra comes in. He is an author, an educator, but of course also founding father of Lola Landscapes. And that was the practice. And then I thought, okay, let me build a team, but maybe this idea of newness and the contemporary is part of the problem. Maybe we have to look backwards to look forwards. And I thought, okay, which kind of historians do I find superbly inspiring? And that's where Véronique Patteeuw and Léa-Catherine Szacka came in the conversation to think through the contemporary through the lens of the historical. Just to explain a little bit how that team came about. From there, we started to talk about the notion of the planetary, which is different than the notion of the global. right? The global would be anything that people have touched. The planetary is really slightly more systemic. This is where weather patterns and so forth come in. But of course, this very memorable picture that we all know by heart is the first moment where we saw the whole Earth, the blue marble. Also was the get-go of a lot of environmental thinking. Actually, I always find it very interesting that this image was taken upside down, even though we could wonder what is up and what is down in outer space, but still, we turned it around in order for us to recognize Africa. And that also says something about how we perceive our map, our territory, and where to take things from there. So this was, in 1972, the beginning of the thinking of the Club of Rome. And that was a crucial part in the thinking of the curators to pick up on that notion of limits to growth, halfway, what is a world system? So this is a first attempt, a graphic visualization of a napkin drawing, literally encompassing all the forces of the world. And the Club of Rome, the scientists actually worked through these notions of the population growth, food per capita, natural resources, industrial output, and of course pollution. And that was maybe a different kind of pollution. We were talking about acid rain and the hole in the ozone layer. We don't talk about that so often anymore. And another important diagram for the curators was this awareness that there has been legislation all around, but what did we do with it? Maybe not enough. We'll get to talk about, I'll already hint at one question, is that many of the audience members during the exhibition, an exhibition that tried to look at where should we start? We have the UN Sustainable Goals, but shouldn't we prioritize? Should we bring some kind of hierarchy in there? How do these relate? And I put this one in also to make a bridge to Nature of Hope, that it should possibly start the wedding cake diagram with the biosphere and investing in that. But back to the exhibition, the audience members actually were in shock when seeing, here's the Pharaoh, the protagonist, the exhibition space, more than 3,500 square meters of, when we got the key, we did barely understand what we were getting ourselves into. No water, no heating, no electricity, and what have you. But of course, a ruinesque former gas holder who could dream for something better to elude maybe the end of a particular system and question where we could go and what the role of time could be. So back to the audience was literally in shock, listening to the many, many guided tours that the curators gave about the amount of information we have been having for the last 50 years when it comes to, let's say, the notion of extraction of, I would nearly say both Earth and ourselves, but I won't go into that. So this is the timeline, just to sketch a little bit for those of you who did not visit the exhibition. Beautiful input, popular culture, architectural experimentation, and of course the land of politics. And one of my all-time favorites, it's not on here, but was that Jimmy Carter, he had put solar panels on the White House, and then Reagan came in, and the first thing he did was actually dismount them. So this notion of green growth was introduced. Well, we know what happened. It's our reality now. I won't say too much, but just to sort of carve out a little bit the idea of the exhibition in and of itself, that dealt with 3 different temporalities. The accelerator, I would nearly say a very Dutch model. We believe in technology and engineering to move us forward. The activist, rooted in the here and now, often working with communities, has a very short temporality. And of course the ancestral thinking, both rooted in material culture and deep, deep generations, taking maybe a look backwards and forwards at the same time. And we obviously also had the conversation on designing for the more than human. That said, the transition arena was also part of the heart of the exhibition, one could say. This is the diagram that Derk can allude to much better than I can, but I dare say that we're probably somewhere here. But that was at the heart of the exhibition, talking with and through particular topics, and people could literally position themselves with their little blue dots, like, where are you? Are you nostalgic, or are you part of the next wave already? Or, well, fast forward, there's no exhibition that ends without a good and strong manifesto, so this is it. I couldn't find it in the book, but apparently it is there. So there's a little bit of a riddle, and I think I want to keep it at that. Welcome, have a seat. The structure is that the authors will speak, then we have the reflections, and then I open up to the audience for questions, and I promise to be really done at 1 minute to 4, so we can share a drink together. Without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to Véronique Patteeuw. She is an architecture historian, educator, and proud, let's say, driving force behind this marvelous publication. And I truly, truly publicly also want to thank you so much for your rigor and pushing back and, well, let's say, for the last 2 years together. Thank you so much. Véronique Patteeuw.
Thank you very much to all of you to share this particular moment with us. I feel that our baby, our common baby, finally arrived. We will project some images while flipping through the book, but I would like to start not with the cover, but with the very, very last page, because a book project like these ones is not just the effort of the 4 people who are on the cover of the book. And I really would like to start with mentioning, name by name, all the persons who have contributed over the last 2 years with their comments, with their remarks, with their time to this book. I'll start with Theodora. I don't know if she's already here. Yes, I think this book would not have been possible without you. Theodora Gilali was the editorial assistant on the exhibition and for the timeline, and she did so many things that I don't know how to do. You did this extremely well, together with Raymond Tang, who was the image editing assistant, who helped enormously the work, based on a research that Saskia Lambers did for the exhibition, an enormous amount of research in the archives, trying to get these images, trying to get the knowledge out there and to put it in the exhibition. Then, of course, Delaine. In other words, Delaine Kemp, who was fundamental in not translating, but making all the phrases that we were writing down in pseudo-English or in English into real English, so it became understandable for a larger audience. Tobias, you will speak later together with Catherine, but I think that this book is really the fruit of the work that you have put in with the graphic design. It's so important to be able to speak with people who try to make this very complicated content into one and coherent book. And then I also would like to thank the 3 persons who were being very severe with us at the moment when we delivered the manuscript back in December 2023. We were a bit afraid of their comments. Tom Avermaete, Daniel Barber, and Elsa de Vienne, who could not be here tonight or this afternoon, who were very generous, very constructive, but also very severe, turning into the book into what it was. So this is my first words to say thank you to all of these persons who were helping us. Second, I think that this book was indeed the fruit, the baby of a very strange forced marriage. I have to admit, I Googled the name of Derk Loorbach and the name of Peter Veenstra when I had discovered that I was working with them to make the exhibition, trying to figure out if we could have a conversation together with them. And I realized, because Léa-Catherine, I knew her for a long time already, that it was such a privilege to be working together, the 4 of us. And that's why we decided also to write the book together as a team, having different voices coming from completely different backgrounds, but being able to accept also these different perspectives into one book. Okay, this being said, I have the honor of introducing you into the structure of the book, while others of my colleagues will dive more into the content. Doing this, I hope this works. Yes. The book is divided in a lot of layers, which is an invitation of you, going from the first page to the very last or diving into a specific topic. We decided to have different parts. There is part 1, part 2 and part 3 because we thought it was so important within the exhibition and of course in our book to look back into time. A lot of the biennales, a lot of the projects today dealing with transition thinking always look towards the future because there is such an urgency to look towards what we might believe as a new future. And we thought it was a very important element in our exhibition and in the work that we did together was to look towards the past, the history of architecture, but also the history of environmental thinking, the history of environmental actions, and to see how these could nourish, in a way, our reflection. So you have one part which is a kind of introductory part, and then we go in part 2 completely into the past. Léa will talk about that. And in part 3, we will try to figure out how we can connect the present and the future. Now, in between these parts, I'll move a little bit, you see timeline. And it's also something, if I close the book, that you see like this, that you see already on the spine and on the outside. We thought for our audience, people who are interested in architecture, in architectural design, landscape design, urbanism, that of course it would be really interesting to accompany architectural thinking also by all these efforts that were happening. I just opened it on the solar panel, Saskia. All these efforts that were already there 50 years long and even much longer. So what we try to do is to create an important timeline that starts in 1952, although 1972 was for us a marker. Why it was a marker? Because we were lucky. In 2022, 2 years ago, it was of course the 50th anniversary of the book of the Club of Rome, was published in 72. But it was also this moment in between the start of the book and the possible date that they calculated that our humanity would have difficulties of surviving on the planet. So we thought, okay, this is a watershed moment, 2022, in which we can really think what we learned from the past and how we can position ourselves towards the future. The word that we used together during all these meetings and conversations and guided tours was the word awareness. Are we aware of all the things that our generations before us tried to do, succeeded in doing, and failed to do as well? I remember that Derk called these projects the failed futures. Can we still learn from all these experimentations in the past? So 1972, I have another slide, is of course this moment where the Club of Rome published its important book, Limits to Growth. And I would like to share this because there's always these other diagrams, but this diagram is the very first diagram that is actually in the book. And it shows very clearly that all of us, me included, we are more or less here, right? We are thinking of what we will do this evening. What are we going to eat when I do see my child again? What do we do tomorrow morning? Are we ready for school or for work? And they said that actually we never, or not enough, think about what will happen in the children's lifetime and also on the scale, on the time scale and the space scale, on the scale of the world. They decided to do this research very particularly on the long scale and the global spatial kind of environment. And I think this is also the kind of framework that we had in mind for our exhibition. While I'm talking, I'm going back to the very first page of the chapter, because I wanted to share the very beautiful thoughts of the founder of the Club of Rome, Aurelio Peccei, an industrialist, an Italian industrialist, who thought, and I'm just going to read this quote, that the Club of Rome was something he really needed to do at that time. He said, "I consider the Club of Rome, first of all, an exciting adventure of the spirit. The exploration and discovery of man's condition in this age of his global empire. At a time of ever-expanding knowledge, when we know incredibly much about so many things, we know incredibly little about our own changed condition. If the Club of Rome may be credited with any merit, it is to have been the first to rebel against this well-nigh suicidal ignorance. It is not, however, impossible to pursue the human revolution capable to change this course." I think if there's something which is really driving us, it's this idea of awareness, stopping the ignorance. And that's why, and I will end maybe with this, that's why we included, I'm just going to flip through them, all these different moments of scientists like Rachel Carson, who already in 62, 10 years before the Club of Rome, said that we should stop using these pesticides because they are very harmful. While others were, for instance, inventing 1970, 2 years before 72, the very first Earth Day, which was limited to the United States at that moment. Greenpeace started, of course. Then there became the very first conference, UN conference dedicated to climate in Stockholm in 72. And so we go on. We see that things happen in a very peculiar way because history is, of course, not linear. We do not go from one point to another, but it's in circles. So at one point, we discovered that at some point, scientists were very convinced of their observations, understandings, and were convincing governments. And at other moments, we see that governments completely fall back on the neoliberal context in which they have to operate. What we also saw is that different moments of awareness came actually into complete understandings of norms, new regulations, but that, for instance, this one is a very beautiful one, that, for instance, in 1989, we were so close to having this global agreement, but we failed because we were not able to sign off and we had to wait to the Paris agreements in 2015. The Club of Rome itself did not stop with publishing and thinking with the book in 72, but also encouraged more and more thinking about the planet. And so they made also in 2002, and in 2022 new versions of its own book, which we also gathered in here. The last part of the timeline, you see there's more rebellion in a way coming into it. There's more knowledge trying to find its way into agreements. And I'll end with the very last pages, in which the Club of Rome itself also celebrated its 50th anniversary with this final book, in which they say Earth is maybe not for some, but Earth is maybe for all. A much more inclusive way of understanding environmental policies. I think, Léa, you can do the next part.
So for those of you who do not know Léa-Catherine Szacka, you can. She is a senior lecturer in architecture theory and history at the University of Manchester, visiting lecturer at Berlage, and also co-founder together with Véronique of PASA, Platform for Architectural Research, but here to talk as the curator of the 2022 Biennale.
Thank you very much, Saskia. And although Véronique has done all the thank you for all of us, I will also add a little thank you to Saskia for giving us this incredible opportunity to do the exhibition and the book, because I think it was really two adventure, also the continuation, but also a very different type of work that we did together. And we were just saying with Véronique before coming here how incredibly smooth it went. I mean, not without some moments of tension, but all in all, incredibly smooth. And I have to say, to write a book with 4 people, we really wanted to be one book. We didn't want it to be an exhibition catalog. And so it was not easy. We tried different things. And I think the final result is a very unique publication. And I'm going to present, Véronique already gave you the big picture and also part of the unique thing that you have here. I'm going to present part 2, Sustainable Architectural Experiment, the Past. So this part is really the more, let's say, historical part of the book. And I think we were all amazed how during the exhibition, people were really curious about the timeline and about everything that was on the timeline, also students and young people who visited the exhibition. Everything that was on this timeline, if you have been to the exhibition, you will remember, were, relatively known episode of history, let's say. But to put them all together in one place was really what made it different, and also for architect to look at these things, because they are moments of awareness that are part of environmental history, but that were not maybe connected with architecture so much before. And this is what we tried to do with this part 2, which is in a way an extension of the timeline, taking really the architectural part. So what did architect do in the past 50 years for mitigating climate change? And what we try to do is that we have 3 chapters. So the first one is really talking about technological innovations. So in a way it is, I mean, and Peter will talk about our 3, we call them our 3 protagonists, the ancestor, the accelerator, and the activist. But they are a bit repeated in these chapters, in these historical chapters, although it's not named as such. And this one is the accelerator. So it's which kind of strategies of accelerations have been done in the past by architects. So everything that has to do with technology, with the quest for energy efficiency, so a lot of examples of solar architecture, and we have really looked at this in this chapter in sort of 3 scales. So solar experiment, then autonomous house, so how a whole house could work with solar, but also other technological innovation, and then finally at the level of urbanism. So I'm flipping through quickly, but finally, at the level of urbanism, like here with the Philippe Rotier and Unger's experiment. So this is for chapter 3. Another thing that I wanted to say and that I forgot to say is that each of these chapters starts, or let's say the entry points, is always a media. And I think this is both very important, but also an approach that Véronique and I have in terms of, we have been working a lot on history of architectural mediation and media in general. So each of the 3 chapters start by a magazine, an exhibition, a book. So it's also to say that these are the moments where these architectural experiments also encounter with the public, with a wider public. So in chapter 2, we talked about chapter 4, in the very famous example of the whole All Heard catalog, which was an entry point to talk about how architects have experimented with circularity, experimentation, and sort of bottom-up practices that changed or tried to mitigate climate change through architecture, also using sort of activist practices, if you'd like. So I will try to show you. Of course, we have examples like Drop City. So those are all examples that are relatively well known, and also, we must say, in a humble perspective, that have been sometimes researched by other scholars in more depth. But I think what we do with those 3 chapters is really to sort of problematize all these examples and put them together within these 3 categories or perspective. So examples of lightweight building, but also examples of, for example, the house by Gilles Perrodin Perrodin and Jourda together. So examples that go also through the 1980s and a bit later in history, and finally to the sort of disappearance of architecture and experiment, where architecture has been, the bottom-up practices has been also, the idea was almost to cancel architecture or to avoid any structure with these beautiful examples that are also fairly known in history of inflatable structure. And finally, the last chapter starts with, or the last chapter of this section, chapter 5, talks more about an approach that make changes in terms of materials, materiality, and takes this long time perspective of the ancestor that you will also hear about later. We start with a very famous exhibition, Architecture Without Architect, which was another, I think, real moment of awareness for architects, that perhaps there was something to learn from ancestral way of building. And so it's a very known example in the history of architecture, and also again of how culture, exhibition and media have changed or marked the history of architecture. So in this chapter we talk about examples of building with earth, but also building with earth, but also building with nature. Another example of here you have architecture without architect, the Architecture de Terre, which is another example of a very famous exhibition, this time in France, that have marked these consciousness and this idea that maybe building with earth and going back to a very ancient tradition was also a good idea. And finally, we end with examples where nature is more used as an image, let's say. Perhaps also we end on a perhaps also critical stance of how nature is used sometimes as an image by architect in this idea also of the ancestor. So these are, in a way, extension in the timeline. For those of you who have visited the exhibition, maybe you remember that we also introduced a series of small models in the exhibition of different houses. So we kind of extracted from these examples and expanded into the book with those 3 chapters. Now I will let Derk? It's Peter, sorry. Explaining more about these 3 protagonists.
Thank you so much for your kind words and beautiful insight. Peter Veenstra was already introduced, but I'll do it once more. Co-founder of Lola Landscape Architects, together with Kees van der Veke and Erik Jan Pleister, but also just a driving force and a lovely overall person. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I have the honor to start with part 3. The present and the future, and I'll take the present, and then Derk will talk about the future. The chapter I would like to talk about is a condensation of the exhibition 2 years ago, and where we had a large collection of projects that we found inspiring. It was quite a heavy selection procedure. It's because the topic we take is so large. And we made it also very big. And I think also in the layout of the book, it's not shy. Let's say, the world, architecture, time. It's big words, and it really. And then of course to find architectural projects that are somehow relevant as a response to those big questions and definitions of the problem is not easy. So we have been very critical. In the end, we managed to bring together projects that we found inspirational for 2 reasons. First of all, we wanted to have projects that were, let's say, not just adopting a narrative, because of course the climate awareness is now everywhere, and architects are, by and large, pragmatic human beings, and easy to adopt new narratives. But we can see that all around, is that people also just see it as a career opportunity to just adopt a new narrative. But we were looking for projects that were taking 1 or 2 steps more to really make a difference. This was one thing, and the other is that we were also very curious to see projects that were taking this time pressure seriously. So this was one fundamental starting point for us, is that right now the urgency is so large that it really requires different attitudes. Something else as business as usual. So we were looking for projects that were, and architects that were consciously taking a different stance. Taking a different stance in response to the time pressure. And this is how we ended up with the 3 protagonists. First of all, and then I flip. We go to the ancestor. Starting here. the ancestor basically resisting this time pressure and consciously slowing down, taking a much more longer time perspective, thinking of far future, linking also back to pre-modern practices and knowledge, and basically having the patience to slowly work towards an alternative reality. And well, we found interesting projects, and I think this is a nice page where sort of the two scales are in a very nice way coming together. Let's say big ideas leading to also big plans, like what you see there on the top, plan for a world park crossing the whole planet. And on the bottom of the page, a project that is taking 20 years to already to establish a very small piece of ecological corridor together with local farmers in Colombia. They both could be actually the same project, and that's, let's say, both starting with the same philosophy, leading to very different products, but definitely also reinforcing each other. So this is the more, let's say, philosophical stance. Then we could see that this is more and more successful, this approach, on many different scales. So both on sort of global level as also on level of the city with sort of radical new plans for large cities like Paris or Antwerp, where, let's say, car is no longer dominant and extremely ambitious green plans are taking over the city. Then we get to the activist, let's say, responding to the time pressure to directly act in the here and now, to also sort of pick up this social agenda, and to sort of hack the system with low-cost means. And what one of the interesting things was there to find is that we could already see this activism starting in the 70s, and of course with many sort of failed examples, or let's say projects starting that then sort of died out a couple of years later. But there were also some that sort of survived time and over the course of 20 years went from sort of niche to mainstream. And this is also one of the hopeful observations we had, is that it, even when living in the moment and hacking the system in the moment itself, it takes a long time to, and then eventually it can reach actually mainstream and be have a big effect. The third, the accelerator, indeed is very Dutch approach, you could say. And perhaps also a bit suspicious, and that also has to do with the image we see here on the left. Accelerator is about thinking of scale and speed, working with innovations, but also somehow working with the system. And we have been following the development of the planning of the line in Saudi Arabia, this Megalomaniac plan to build a new city of 200 kilometers. And one of the issues with this accelerator approach is that it has been always the dominant approach in our market economy, our profit-driven economy. So it has been so much associated with what's wrong nowadays, that we see a bit of a resistance against this way of thinking. While we think it's very important to of course, adopt a more, let's say, philosophical stance at first, and accelerator or ancestor thinking, to be activistic when it comes to the social agenda, but to not forget about scale, not to forget about speed, and let's say we also gathered interesting examples. Maybe to pick out one here, we asked the research office 250 plus from Milan to, let's say, do a research on an accelerator topic they thought was most relevant nowadays. And they picked up the topic of laboratory meat. And they showed the potential of what that could mean for agriculture and freeing up agricultural space. And the potential of it is so large that you wonder why not more landscape architects, urban designers are picking up this topic and deal with this. We conclude with the observation that we need all three velocities at the same time. And this is also what was a bit more easier in the exhibition, where we could position projects in a more of a continuous field. Of course, the book is more structured. But this is also the sort of our big conclusion in the end, that we need these three velocities at the same time. We've been also trying to, in the some of the research projects, we started to combine consciously these three different attitudes in projects. And this is still ongoing right now. Shall I give the word to you?
Thank you, Peter. Then I will introduce Professor Dr. Derk Loorbach, a professor in socio-economic transitions, director of Drift, and principal investigator of the Design Impact Transition DIT platform of the Erasmus University of Rotterdam, for the last introduction to the book.
Yes, thank you all, and I share also the obviously the acknowledgements done. I want to thank Saskia specifically for keeping me in the team. It was sort of a gift from the present, from the past, and you took me into the present. And Vero for, I mean, Saskia said that you were the driving force, so thanks for all the effort in there. But it was also a joy to be involved in the exhibition as well as in the book. I learned a lot about architecture and design. Don't know if I appreciate architects and designers more now, but I learned a lot. And I think it also made for a very interesting intellectual journey that also really pushed the way I am thinking, and I think also some colleagues in the transitions field. The going back into the past, it's a part of transitions work anyway, but because to understand the presence we have to go back. The interesting twist that came in the exhibition, but that is also hopefully in the book, is that if you go through the timeline, and it ends with Greta, and it ends, yes, with Earth for All, but also with the escalations and the heat waves and the existential crisis that we are in. So the transition moment, question mark, basically is the start of a conversation that maybe we needed 50 years of build-up of awareness, of pressure, and of urgency to arrive in the current moment. And this chapter, it's full of more conceptual graphs, and this was presented already. It basically formulates the hypothesis that we are finally in a moment in time where things start to shift more structurally and more systemically, and Saskia says we're here, but that is an hypothesis. And there is a lot of reason to take this seriously, because what this graph basically does, it summarizes years of understanding complex systems change. And it basically draws the conclusion from historical examples that you need a lot of pressure and destabilization, as we say, and a lot of experimentation and alternatives to push a system out of equilibrium. And the system in this case is the fossil, linear, extractive economic model that we're all living in. It opens up a possibility space of any alternative future besides business as usual. So the hypothesis in this chapter that we are in a transition moment and breaking path dependency is basically the start to then think, okay, if we then see all these alternative positions and perspectives that architecture holds, what kind of alternative futures should we then live for or explore? And that is sort of the last chapter of the book. It's not a conclusion, but sort of an open-ended reflection, but it is the end of our timeline. As Saskia also said, we built a transition arena in the exhibition, so the timeline ended in the transition moment, in a space for speculating radical alternative futures. And one scheme we often use is here. It's built on backcasting. And the transition narrative is basically that if we know what is unsustainable, what pushes us out of equilibrium, we might start by thinking about radical alternative futures that are still sustainable. Ways of living, of building, and of running an economy that are not only within planetary boundaries, but maybe restore biodiversity, and are also maybe reparative in a social sense. And what does that mean? Because I learned one of the things, one thing in the past process is that architects, designers, they can imagine such futures, but in practice often built for people with money, which then ends up being more of the same. So we end with reflections on designing radical transitions, cities without cars, buildings that produce more energy than they consume, using landscapes in a way that restore biodiversity and produce food. It's all being done, it's all being practiced, the evidence is there. And the question is, how can we use the power of design, architecture, but also research to make radical transitions visible and tangible? And this was one of the illustrations on the wall of the transition arena, a drawing by Jan Rothuizen, that basically tells us to look with other eyes or glasses on to the world around us. Yes, we see a lot of unsustainability, but if you look differently, you see the examples everywhere and the practices of an alternative future, and we need the collaboration between all these velocities to take us there. I think I'll end it there. Don't tell Saskia, but if you look here, then you might see some exit messages, but that's for the people that get the book. I think I'll hand over to Tobias for who did the marvelous design of this all. Thanks.
Thank you, Derk. Fantastic. Indeed, here to share some insights on the structure of the book is Tobias Rutger, who together with Katrien Baumgartner worked tirelessly on the structure of the book, is a Berlin-based design firm, and as mentioned, also did the visual identity of It's About Time exhibition. And if you ever want to work with a graphic designer who is perfect, fast, generous, on time, just Google Stahl, and a lovely person also. Just Google Stahl R in Berlin. The floor is yours.
Mm-hmm.
Give it up for Tobias.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the invitation and this lovely event. I mean, it's a bit tough for me to speak after such great speakers that I used to speak every second weekend, I have the feeling, or kind of are used to those events every weekend, basically. So, yeah, as you said, design firm sounds very big. We are kind of a small practice. It's me and my wife, and Katrien is kind of working with us. So, yeah, 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, we started working on the exhibition, which was kind of a really interesting and kind of challenging project for us as well. I mean, we're a small team, so a kind of event in this size is always a kind of challenge. But I think we had a really good conversation with the curators, and something quite beautiful it turned out to be. Maybe some words. Usually if we work with exhibitions and catalogs, it's a kind of difficult topic, because what does a catalog do? Mostly it's kind of reviewing what is in the exhibition, and this can be difficult because when will the catalog be released? Is it kind of to the opening, but then it mostly kind of, because it has pre-production, it can only show so much. So who's the audience then? Is it kind of a token for the people who take it from the exhibition as a kind of, I've been there, or is it kind of something that's beyond the exhibition and has certain text that kind of build on what's shown in the exhibition? So, but it's always difficult to do that because some of the works might not be ready in time. So sometimes you work with a kind of template, so you're able to include images and text right before print deadline, for example. So in terms of design, it can be difficult. So in this situation, we were super happy that they took more time, exactly kind of 2 years, which is quite a good time frame to make a book and to have good discussions around the book. So maybe I talk about some of the visual decisions or the kind of design we did. Usually if it's a catalog, you kind of take the design of the exhibition and you kind of adapt it into a book, which isn't ideal most of the time. And in this situation, we were able to kind of build on the exhibition or design on the design of the exhibition as well. So meaning we could introduce a new font, we could kind of deal with content a bit differently that is more suitable to a publication. Cover-wise, we have the blue marble in silver in this term. It's maybe not the most inventive kind of imagery to this topic, but we had a lot of different kind of versions, but it turned out it's the most striking and in this term, almost iconic image. If we go to the inside, it was quickly clear that we have those different chapters and that we have kind of different parts with the timeline. Véronique, or I think Saskia already mentioned, we wanted the parts to be visible from the outside, so which led to a decision that we want color pages. And within the exhibition, so Saskia, Véronique was very keen on it shouldn't have to do anything with the exhibitions, but we felt we needed some little design hints or clues. For example, in the exhibition, there was a very prominent timeline as well, which was on a silver wall. So that's why we decided to use silver in terms of additional color for those parts and use kind of a slightly different layout. And for the main part, we wanted it to be almost like a novel. So meaning like it's open paper, it kind of has a kind of good feel to read. The lines are not too long, but at the same time, of course, it's a kind of book that needs those captions and quotes. So we kind of made some space for this. By doing a book, it's always about budget and what are you able to afford, meaning like in this sense, we wanted to use the silver for the kind of timeline part. And in terms of print production, this is an additional color. So you print with 5 colors, which is a bit more expensive. But to counter that, we decided to make the other part black and white, or in this sense, silver and white. So all the images you see are kind of in a special profile. So they're just not black, but with a little bit of silver inside. And like that, you can save money sometimes because you don't need to kind of print 4 colors and you don't need to afford to kind of use 4 colors, but you can kind of use 2 colors, save a bit of money, but still has silver as a kind of color that makes the things a bit more interesting at times. What else to say? One thing that's maybe worth mentioning, we try to be as cost effective as possible. So a lot of books are in the same size, meaning, I can't remember, 70? Yeah, 1724, because it's the optimal kind of how you, like a book is printed on a big sheet, and that's the optimal kind of how many pages you can fit on one sheet. So it's a kind of common size, but still a handy size. So for a book that's to be read, it's kind of really good. Then for the cover paper, this is maybe something else that's a hint. So beside the secret hidden manifesto that Saskia couldn't find, which is under the kind of wrapping, We used the paper I wanted to use for a long time. So finally, the project turned out to be this book. So I had this paper in mind for many, many years. And we used kind of for the Biennale itself, we used the kind of color range from yellow to a toxic green. And this is kind of one of the colors that's very toxic, and a color that's kind of the paper itself has the color. You can't print this color. It's so kind of intense. And we had some leftover papers from the printing of the cover, and we used this as a kind of bookmark as well. So we try to find all these little references to the exhibition, but still keep in mind this is a product in itself, a book, not a catalog. So yeah, we were quite happy. And it was a fantastic journey. One last thing maybe to Véronique, because usually if we design books that heavy in terms of page size and text, you send over the PDF many times, and usually you get corrections like it's 522 corrections in the PDF. And we got the PDF after our kind of first design back, and it was 62 corrections, which is insane because usually the texts aren't prepared that good. So that's maybe kind of reflection on how good this process and the whole kind of working together was. Thank you.
Lovely. So I'll put the poster girl back. Thank you, Véronique. While I ask the curators to take a seat, please don't sit on one side. Maybe distribute yourself a little bit. I will introduce the three, let's say, peer. It's like music. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, I think that's going right. I just don't want to have two camps. That's the basic idea. So perfect. Who could ever want a peer reading with such stellar thinkers? I mean, this is just amazing. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for taking time out of your weekend. I will introduce Mr. Daniel Barber first, the professor and chair of architecture, history and theory at the TU Eindhoven. Welcome to the Netherlands. We're very honored to have you here. He is the author of many publications, but one I'll just lift out. This is Modern Architecture and Climate, Design for Air Conditioning. And of course also the thinker behind the whole After Comfort user's guide that is currently on eFlux. Please have a seat and give him an applause because he came all the way. I'm a secret groupie of Tom Avermaete. He does not know that, but now he does. Very, very in awe of the precision of your thinking and your well-voicedness. Which comes with a professorship of history and theory and urban design at the ETH in Zurich, where you unfortunately left us to move to in 2018, and your research focuses on architecture, the city, and the changing roles, approaches and tools architects, urban designers have in the sort of cross-cultural perspective. Please have a seat. Welcome. Janna Bystrykh, she is of course one of the leading force in the curator team of this edition. So we're bridging two biennales here. Besides that, she has her own firm, a long-standing history of setting up places like Szacka, working at OMA, now again has her own firm. She's also at the helm of an MA, the Masters of Architecture at the Academy of Architecture in Amsterdam. We also know her as a filmmaker, a marvelous movie we had in the last Biennale called The Great Plains, where I would say hinted already at the core of her research on anything from regenerative agriculture to systemic thinking around food, to feminist practices, to ancestral land. Well, too many things to mention, but also currently working on a book on play for something completely different. So please give it up for Janna Bystrykh. Daniel, if you allow me, I will jump straight in. Maybe you would want to pick a microphone. You have read the book, and I was wondering, maybe, since Derk just told us we are at this pivotal moment, towards precarious and uncertain futures, the question, of course, emerges, what is the role of architecture history in all of that? And maybe you could sort of answer through the lens of that your first reflections on the publication.
Fabulous, thank you so much. And you know, again, obviously, congratulations to all of the many authors and those involved, and such a great opportunity to be here. Thanks to all of you for coming. Yeah, you know, I think there's something really interesting. I mean, there's a kind of play in the title, right? In the sense of it being about time. You know, time is the subject, right? And then also the kind of urgency of like, it's about time, right? And I think, you know, what that suggests or helps relative to the question too, you know, how do we think, as historians, how do we think about urgency is a kind of an open question. On the one hand, because part of our job is to sort of watch the slow changing of forces, right? And the kind of causal dynamics that are contingent and happen over generally long periods of time. So you know, for both, I would say, historians and for architects, the sort of question of urgency becomes a real challenge, right? And I think urgency is already a challenge, right? I mean, I think anytime you kind of want to do something quickly, usually there's costs, right? You don't do it as well, or you kind of forget something in the other room, or you know, the kind of something happens that kind of shakes it up a little bit. And generally speaking, there are kind of winners and losers in these kind of urgent moments, right? And there's a lot of interesting debates around, you know, one of the sort of structures of thinking about environment that we've been struggling with for a couple of decades. You know, states of emergency, to sort of go back to Benjamin and others, are kind of opportunities for oppression, right? States of emergency are situations where rights are compromised for what is being argued as the sort of better good, et cetera. And so there's a lot of discussion of when we are thinking about the urgency of climate change today, we need to sort of temper some of that anxiety around urgency relative to rights and marginalization and equity and sort of, you know, not letting people sort of fall to the wayside just because we're in such a hurry, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, if we do temper the urgency accordingly and sort of, you know, sort of making sure we're covering all the bases, we're in effect compromising the rights of future people, right? So either we're, I mean, to put it a bit too bluntly, either we're kind of compromising the rights of people today, right, by allowing things to happen or making certain decisions that recognize that, you know, carbon will accumulate here or these effects will happen over there, or we're saying, well, let's not go too fast because we don't want to disrupt the economy, we don't want to destabilize things too much, right? So let's just slow that down a little bit, but in effect, then we're just sort of compromising someone else, right? So I really appreciate, it's in part to say that I really appreciated this model around destabilization on the one hand in the kind of last part of the book, but also just the intensity of the detail and the kind of narrative of the first and second parts of the book that really help us to understand how these narratives of transformation, however feeble, however not urgent enough, have been embedded into our stories of architecture and you know, how we want to change them, right? So to cycle back to your specific question, you know, drafting histories of architecture, writing histories of architecture, disseminating, talking about histories of architecture, that build out of the core knowledge that's being developed here, right? That there's such a huge amount of knowledge that the field has around decarbonization, around different types of materials, around circularity and all these issues. What are the, you know, thinking about the cultural obstacles that prevent us from sort of operating in those ways is, I think, part of what historians, as much as it doesn't sound like a historical object, part of what historians need to do.
I will first ask the three speakers to reflect a little bit, and then we can open up and start weaving the questions, if that's okay. Tom, maybe towards you, this idea of the changing roles, approaches, and tools of the architect. Yeah. We've now seen, let's say, historic precedences are out there. So maybe you could talk a little bit on why are we not doing it yet, right? So why can't we embrace this more environmental way of thinking?
I'm not sure that this is on. That's well. First of all, I also think that I need to congratulate everybody, and maybe Saskia, to immediately answer to your questions. One of the things that came up while reading the book is really that I thought, well, we are a very, very what I would call amnesic field, a field where amnesia is very, very strongly. I think that the book is really showing us that indeed there have been a wide variety of experiments in the field of architecture, urbanism, urban planning. And one of the questions that really trigger, I mean, in a variety of ways, dealing with materials in a particular way, dealing with energy in a particular way. And one of the first questions I think that the book is raising for me is really this question: why were these experiments not evaluated, criticized, taken further, as it were as well? It's a bit amazing, to be very honest. When you read the book, you ask yourself, well, how can it be that apparently for a few decades we've just forgotten about all of these experiments, and only right now we're saying it's about time to reconsider these experiments as well. And I think a second question that is raising, still dealing with this amnesia, is what were maybe the sort of forces, the resistances, the forces that were resisting that these experiments were embraced, adopted, implemented, one can say as well. I don't think that there's a true answer of that in the book, but I would like to ask maybe some of the authors if they could let's say respond to that. So for me, the very first question is this question of the amnesia. I mean, where does it come from? What were the resistances that were there? The second question that I see, I'm going to do three quickly. The second question that I see is really this question of the role of architecture. I mean, I think still when looking at the book, there's a very beautiful citation of Oswald Matthias Ungers in the book on page 111. And they're saying, and he's saying that actually the question of dealing with environment and climate is not necessarily only a technical question, but it's an architectural question. Of course, for Ungers, an architectural question means a typological question, a morphological question, and so on. And there again, that's also a sort of question I think that the book is raising: in how far is this indeed part of the core of our field, not something that is added to architecture as new technologies, solar panels, heating pumps, or what do I know? But in how far is it part of the core of our field? To me, that remains a question even after having read the book. And the last question, or the third question that I quickly would like to evoke, which the book is raising, is really about our conceptions of modernity, I would say. I mean, how have we been looking as architects, again, when I'm saying we as architects, as urban designers, to what we consider to be modern, fresh, progressive, let's say. And I think there the book is really also problematizing quite a bit. Véronique showed this diagram of the Club of Rome with space and time, and looking beyond your own space and your own time, but I think also particularly what Derk introduced about the various velocities that simultaneously need to be taken into consideration. For me, this is indeed an idea of how we can think about temporalities in architecture and urban planning in a different way. So there, I think also it's really sort of putting up a mirror to us and asking us, okay, what sort of a conception of modernity do we hold as fields? And is it not by time, to use the title one more time, to rethink, to recodify, to reconsider these conceptions of modernity as well? So these were, let's say, three questions that really came across very, very strongly when I was reading the book, and I would be very interested to hear the authors speak about that.
Fantastic. I'll definitely come back to the three points. Maybe, Peter, you can simmer already, since you are today representing the notion of the practice. So the second question is for you. Amnesia, maybe a bit more for the historians. But before we delve into the conversation, maybe Janna, would you care to share some first reflections on the publication that you're currently holding?
Yeah, again, congratulations to the team, the whole team, because kind of living through the current exhibition, I really appreciate just to what extent these really are two different projects, and to have the longevity and having the energy to do it again, and really taking the visitor for another experience of your work, I think is really admirable, but also very necessary. And I think that also brings me to the comment, or the kind of the reflection that I'd like to share to start off the conversation is the timeline was, of course, very prominent in the exhibition itself. It's very prominent in the book. In the in the exhibition, it was the voices of the practitioners, the thinkers, and other experts who were supporting that timeline in the publication. It's your voices. But I think what really struck me, and I don't know whether it's the compilation or the editing, so maybe there's also a question in there, but it seems when we look back at the 60s and the 70s, there was a moment where this conversation was still very personal. It was about people trying to find connections with each other. It was about academics who were writing very popular texts to create a certain awareness to climatic issues, to environmental issues, which then drove a certain type of bureaucratic organizations to take on and adopt certain practices. The further you get along in the book, you see kind of how technical the conversation has become and how inaccessible it has become. And I think it's something that we maybe not reflect enough upon. And in that sense, I think the book really starts to do that, in that, yes, the donut economy, a very valuable concept, but it's one of the many concepts that has been kind of thrown out there to which practitioners often don't know the answers. And who is the filter? Who is the translation? Who is that voice that brings it forward? And I think this is what this book really starts to do for people who are outside the scope of those languages, of those deep research that has been happening, which is also very necessary. But I think in recent time, we have missed that cultural step. And which brings me back also to the exhibition, because I think that was also a very important work that you did in there in trying to make this, again, a cultural public conversation in the way that the exhibition was staged, and also with the interpretations of which the book was written now.
Fabulous. I'll kick off with some questions, and just raise your hand if you feel you want to jump in. Maybe, Peter, we start with this question of that Tom put forward, is the role of the practice. Maybe as a provocation also the limits of a practice, right?
Yeah.
Because we sort of tend to think we can save the world, but what would your answer be to this realism check? Why are we so late?
No, I think it's indeed incredibly difficult to change the practice as a practitioner, and because we depend so much on everyone around us in the whole chain, starting of course with the clients, available investments, and so on. By the way, not only as a practitioner, but also I think as an organization like IABR, you depend a lot on your funder, the people that
I'll have you know that we have 40% of eigen inkomstennorm, but that's beside the point. But you're right. There's this dependency is what you're saying. Relational practice, maybe more.
Yeah, exactly. So somehow trying to do the right thing with a conventional client only has a very limited effect. So I think part of the challenge is also to find other clients, and this is also part of the projects that we found were successful in that, actually, in basically creating your own group of clients with introducing a new story. Mm-hmm. Another thing is that you don't need to achieve everything in one project, and I think that also this idea of having a side job or something you do on Friday or on Saturday while you're also doing more conventional work, I think is also something that should be taken very seriously. And we saw also very inspiring examples of that, of a company like Group A that is really addressing the carbon topic successfully, but next to also doing more conventional work.
Yeah. Maybe Véronique, I'd like to compress two questions in one. Why did, or what, if I say it more positively, what did the extra 2 years enable for making the book? So what, like the transition, but maybe you could sort of tie in this notion of amnesia that Tom put forward.
I'll just bypass your question, because we talked about this very difficult question, what changed in the 2 years? what could we have done differently? I think that Derk has some answers, so I'll just turn towards Tom's questions, if I may. I think that there are two very important things in relation to the amnesia and maybe in relation to modernity as well. And it has to do with the idea of authorship in connection with the idea of what architecture is about. We were all trained that as architects, you start from a clean slate. There's a surface, there's not a thickness in the soil, right? And then you build, and you build something new. You're not going to take an existing building and just take something out and then it becomes a project about maintenance or repair. Because the authorship of the singular author, although it's a collective effort, is something that is very strong. And I have the impression that all these experimentations in the past, trying to figure out how we can be maybe more humble, less pronounced about the aesthetics also and the value of what architecture is about. Architecture as a form of art and not architecture as a way of thinking about spatial configurations today, which is maybe something completely different, is holding us back from really implementing environmental thinking. That for me is a very first one. The second one in relation to the project of modernity, I was wondering if it doesn't have to do something with the idea of emancipation. The project of modernity was this idea of the emancipation of all of us in relation to God and nature, right? We have more knowledge, we become stronger, we have the machines, the tools to create our bright new world. And we came to realize that it has to do with domination. And maybe now we have to kind of shift from this very linear perspective of we go from worse to better and to the best into something that is very circular. One of the things that Léa proposed when doing the exhibition was not to make a linear timeline, but to start with 72, and then you had to kind of go like there to the 50s, and then you had to jump, because we realized that time is maybe not linear and that there is this circularity. And maybe we have to think of today not in terms of modernity anymore and let it go. That's a kind of awareness that we had with the book.
And is it substituted by something else, you feel?
Well,
let's say the awareness is one, but let's say the idea of modernity as either a style or a narrative.
Well, the modernity was this ambition that we shared, this one big project. And there were maybe two. There was capitalism and there was communism, etc. And then, not me, but Lyotard said in the postmodernity, there is this loss of this big project. There is the loss of this big meta-narrative. We do not share one story anymore. We have a lot of different stories. And maybe this is, again, a kind of story we can share, all in our different ways, all with different perspectives, all from different disciplines, but maybe it's, again, something we need to share. Yeah. So,
I see the time ticking and I still have so many questions. Derk, it was already proposed that you would answer the question on time. During my introduction, I said that the audience was actually in shock that we know so much, yet the transitions that we are seeking for are going very, very slowly. Is that something you share, or has something twisted in the last 2 years?
There's so much to say, but I'll pick up on your comment. So for us, it's about time is also a paradox. So sudden change, also in transition theory, it takes a very long time to get to that point. And then things start to shift quickly and then have a very long durée for materializing and becoming clear. And I think interesting thing the last 2 years, I mean, we were at the point in 2022 that it was existential urgency and Extinction Rebellion said we have 8 more years to go before we all die. And now we're 2 years later and there's still 12 protests, but nobody cares. But it is also a sign of the time that we now have a government in the Netherlands that actually is a transition denier. They call a crisis on topics that aren't really a crisis. And on the issues that science says we're in crisis, they say, well, we keep the targets, but we don't do anything about it. It will all be fine. So it's a subliminal time. I don't know if it's postmodern times. But it is certainly a sign of a transition for us. And it's even more a call to action that the institutions are failing. and we have to build the new institutions ground up, basically, which then connects nicely to the current exhibition.
Yeah. Maybe if you'd want to give the microphone to Léa-Catherine, you have done extensive research on, let's say, the cultural aspect of our field, like representation. So we are now talking about new narratives. Is this, where do you see maybe the exhibition as a sort of cultural vehicle moving through the lens of your extensive research on the topic?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it also allows me to, in a way, answer one of Tom's point, which was the amnesia, quite like the amnesia. As an historian, I think that one of the way to explain this amnesia is actually the urgency. Is that maybe as architect we work in project, so we are always like from one project to the other, and there is not this time to stop and to reflect back on time. And that is what, in a sense, the space of the exhibition or the space of the cultural project allows us. So an exhibition is, it's a way of connecting with the public. It's also a way, often we say that architects use exhibition to do research, they use exhibition as a time to like stop and think, but it's also an apparatus. So here I think with the book we show it's an exhibition, it's a book, it's reviews in the newspaper, it's guided visit, like we did a lot of guided tour. I think that was a very insightful thing for us as curator, like because when you do an exhibition, you also have the feedback loop from the public. So I think that I'm not sure if I make sense because I feel like but I think that this time and this space that the exhibition or the cultural aspect of the discipline, because we know that architecture is not just about buildings, so that's also architecture, gives us, this is maybe the way to get out of amnesia. I don't know, because I think otherwise in practice, I mean, I'm not in practice and I've never been so much so, but I have this feeling, I've been an architecture student, so I know this kind of, you have to finish a project in school, so this kind of urgency of the architecture or the building project, let's say, maybe doesn't give you the time to reflect on history, and that's what the exhibition gives you. So hopefully that's what we try to do. And just to add to this, I want to add to Véronique's answer. I think we did do a lot of road from the exhibition to the book, let's say, because it's also a circle, right? Because the exhibition help us to have theorize these three time, the ancestor, the activist, and the accelerator. And then we went back and looked at history through that lens, and it's also a circle. So I would think, well, I hope we did something.
But it's also interesting that you forced architects to choose, and now I heard Peter say, a good architect has all three temporalities in its practice. But
and it's important
we're entering the last minute, so if I don't see hands, I just keep on going, and I'll be going towards Janna, please. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry. Tying into amnesia, but also in general, I was actually interested in what made you choose the timeline, the events or the things that happened, because I feel like that is also very difficult maybe to choose these points, whereas there's so much more also that happened. So I would be interested in what were the guidelines you chose for yourself.
Good one, criteria.
I'll start and then Léa can probably add things. You have to know that we did this whole project of the exhibition in 9 months. So we were very fastly pregnant of this whole exhibition. So that's one. Second, there had been so much research already done on so much of the environmental history that we had a good starting point. So we didn't have to kind of invent things. But then we decided, the four of us together, what is the story that we really want to tell with this timeline? The first one is awareness. Awareness that it is not something from 72, but more and more that we worked on it, we had to go back in time and we arrived in the 50s. Second is that things start, for instance, with scientists, but when the scientist doesn't have an echo with public authorities or with the media, it doesn't go further. So we decided also to include film posters of eco-terrorism and things that we saw on television in the 70s. So we decided to have all these different layers of what climate history was about within the exhibition in both very high scale and very broad perspectives. And then we said, it's not all hopeful. There are so many hopeful moments within these very first stages, around 72, but then all of a sudden you see denial, you see pessimism, you see disbelief, you see criticism, and we needed to give them a voice as well. So a lot of them in the 80s and in the beginning of the 1990s were much more showing the kind of shadow side of it. And I think all of it together showed that this history, again, is not something linear, and that there are so many different entry points in the timeline, making a circle to where we are today. That's a bit how I would say it.
I don't have anything to add.
I will add something. We had fierce conversations also on, let's say, which gaze do you embrace? So it was very clear for the curatorial team and myself that within the given time frame we would not do just. So I would say that the main narrative is still from the Western perspective. I find it important.
No, it's yeah,
go for
exactly.
It.
Because I teach on the basis of the book also a course at the students in Lausanne, for instance. They were very, very critical, and they were like, "Mais madame," in French. They were like, "You are teaching only this story of this white male American scientists." And so this whole conversation about global north and global south was somewhere in the selection of the projects that we have in the exhibition, and is maybe something that we should work on more in our next book.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious because it is a very interesting and a very comprehensive way of explaining the past and its history of architecture and what we can learn from it. But I'm also curious, what do we in the architecture unlearn to really step in the future?
Fantastic question. So now that we know all of this, how do we unlearn and where are the perspectives? I was actually going to go towards Janna also through the lens of the symposium we had on Friday, where you rigorously set out the guidelines intellectually for nature of knowledge, right? So what kind of educational / unlearning is out there, or to your understanding, also taking Friday and maybe even the content of this exhibition into consideration?
That's a big question. I think, yeah, so Friday we had a kind of a long session here on education from different perspectives, on knowledge and post-growth, forms of knowledge, but also the link between practice and education, where really a wonderful group of people across Europe mostly, with some voices from the United States as well. We really had a conversation that it's a very kind of, maybe reflecting also on what is being discussed today, it's a time where many things are at play. And so when we look at the educational system, on the one hand, we're really kind of advocating for other than human perspective, other material practices, other relationship with our environment, rereading of our history, what is the history that we're reading, why are we reading it, and so on. At the same time, we are projecting a lot of this onto the students, yet the practice isn't able to sustain it to a great extent. So we're also putting the students in a position where they are exposed to a lot of pressures, a lot of questions and kind of ideas and narratives that are not yet the reality. And so at the same time, there is also a question, we cannot retreat ourselves either. And so we as educators, as practitioners, we also have to open ourselves up, and that's also what the show tries to do, is to have this conversation of relationality to the landscape from which our architecture is emerging. So if we're talking about timber, where does it come from? Is CLT an actual applicable situation here, or should we only do light timber structures? If we're talking about parts of France and parts of Belgium, should we not only talk about raw earth bricks or things like that? And so I think there are many things, and I'm now talking of very practical things, but I think the level of learning at the moment in architectural school, and I think in architectural practices, it's almost like pick a topic. And I think that makes it a very exciting moment at the same time, both as practitioner and as a student. We all have an opportunity again which I don't think we really had 20 years ago or 30 years ago. What kind of architecture do you want to practice? What aspect of architecture or design practice actually you think is relevant? Because I think we are at that point that all voices are incredibly important because there is so much to do. And kind of we're just starting to comprehend that in the various fields.
I'm closing off, but the floor is yours.
No, I was just want to add on, there are so much things to do. There's just one thing that I'm very interesting to mention, just form, architecture and form, because, we've been talking a lot, are we back at the high modernism where instead of light and more space and air, now we're doing carbon neutral and trying to, are we forgetting the cultural historical situatedness of architecture? And what kind of new pragmatism does this provoke, and how do we think about more than human new perspectives for our world? And I wanted to ask if you want to reflect.
That's fantastic. It actually is like introducing a new kind of aesthetics, maybe a new kind of hyper reality, and a reappreciation of both historical locality as its material reality. I think that I was going to go for Dan, but Véronique wants to answer.
Please,
no, go for it.
No, but we can do like a thing together.
And maybe, maybe I may tie in before we're really closing, because I promised to be strict, and we started 5 minutes later, so I am closing off. But maybe while preparing for this, I was thinking, has the notion of time itself actually changed in the field of architecture? So this idea of the conversation on anything from accelerated theory, or that we used to build for eternity, but now we have a turnover of 15 years, the facade is the only thing we care about. This is the cynical version, obviously, but the time question. So connected to the re-evaluation of our current day and age.
Well, I'll just say quickly, I think the question of the sort of values, kind of what values come after modernism or after postmodernism or after post-postmodern, I think we're still struggling to, not just in architecture, but as a broad global, society and culture, to really kind of understand the parameters of what we're facing and how that will have kind of impacts and resonance across our cultural forms. And just two other quick things around that. Like, I think on the one hand, the amnesia, it was actually a project, right? There was there was a moment in the 50s and 60s when there was a lot of environmental discussion on architecture, and in the 2 seconds I have left, it was shut down, right? And shut down by very powerful people and kind of kept under the table. And only in the last 15, 20 years, right, have these narratives begun to reemerge. And obviously it's more complicated than that. But I think the kind of notion, how do we create a different culture is part of what that suggests, right? Given that a culture that was kind of keeping in the environment on the outside was largely the culture of architecture. I'll let you do the time thing.
Oh no! No. No, I think that in response to the unlearning and to what about form and the way how we deal with architecture, there were two words that were incredibly interesting in the conversations that we had on Friday about education. First, value. What is the value that we give to the building? What is the value that we give to architecture? What is the value that we give to all these other elements that we have talked about in the book and here today? So that's, and I think in our teaching, we need to reconsider what is of importance and what is the frame of value. And the second one is, of course, the role of the architect. If you talk about demineralization, if you talk about reuse or repair or maintenance of buildings, if you think only about structures, but they are resilient for the very, very far future, if you talk about all these things, living materials that are in the soil as a starting point, it was very beautifully mentioned by Phoebe on Friday, students are thinking about what is living in the ground and then start to think of a project that they will put maybe on this ground. This, I think, opens up a whole new spectrum of positions, roles for architects, architecture, that we need to start teaching and that we need to start embracing as well. And maybe the book is a kind of invitation to start doing that.
Fantastic. There's, I'm sure, many more questions, but I suggest we have them by a drink. Since I've been made fun of that I didn't find the last one, I feel that I should tell you that these 10 guidelines might be something you can act today. So I'll run by you. Act upon climate change as a short-term problem. Hold on. That's at least one. Seize the transformative moment. Think radical, act pragmatic. Develop capacities rather than knowledge. Share values, not profit. Design for desirable futures. Root locally, resonate globally. Study systems, everything is connected. Create context for others to blossom. Connect to deep time. Scale up, scale out, scale deep. And more importantly, just take time. Please, ladies. I feel we could have talked much, much longer, but it's always good to sort of keep people on their toes. I have to, of course, say and wholeheartedly thank you to the publisher NAI 010, who has guided our process, and the book is also for sale, of course. I'm sorry, I have to say that. But please help me thank our panel, our authors, our former curators and current curators of the Architecture Biennale, Derk Loorbach, Léa-Catherine Szacka, Daniel Barber, Véronique Patteeuw, Peter Veenstra, Janna Bystrykh, and of course Tom Avermaete. Thank you so much. Give it up. Zoom out enough. Okay, 1, 2, 3, there we go.